The Blonde Knight Eric Hartman. He shot down 352 enemy aircraft, more than any fighter pilot in history. The Soviets put a bounty on his head worth a fortune. His own commanders thought he was reckless and nearly court-martialed him multiple times. But he survived 1,425 combat missions, was shot down 16 times, and walked away every time. The Russians called him the Black Devil. His enemies feared him. His wingmen worshipped him. This is the story of the deadliest fighter ace in aviation history, a 22-year-old who became a legend in the sky. Stay until the end to discover what he did after the war that made his former enemies respect him even more than his combat record. Eric Alfred Hartman was born on April 19, 1922, in Weissach, Wittenberg, Germany. He entered a world still recovering from World War I's devastation, a Germany humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, economically devastated and politically unstable. His father, Alfred Eric Hartman, was a doctor who had served as a military physician during World War I. His mother, Elisabeth Wilhelmine Machtolf, was a pioneering woman, one of Germany's first female glider pilots, who had earned her pilot's license in 1911 when aviation was still experimental and dangerous. Young Eric, called Booby, little boy by his family, grew up in a household where aviation was celebrated and encouraged. His mother's passion for flying shaped his entire childhood. She took him to airfields, showed him gliders and aircraft, and taught him that the sky was a place of freedom and possibility. In 1920s Germany, where economic hardship and political turmoil dominated daily life, aviation represented escape, adventure, and a connection to Germany's pre-war technological achievements. The Hartman family struggled financially during Eric's childhood. Germany's economy collapsed in the 1920s, with hyperinflation destroying the value of savings and making daily life a struggle for middle-class families. Dr. Hartman worked constantly, but could barely provide for his family. Elizabeth supplemented their income by teaching flying lessons and taking passengers on aerial tours. Young Eric watched his mother work tirelessly, maintaining her independence and passion for aviation despite economic hardship. In 1928, when Eric was 6 years old, the family moved to China. Dr. Hartman had been offered a medical position in Changsha, providing better income than he could earn in Depression-era Germany. The family lived in China for 2 years, during which Eric experienced a completely different culture and learned some Chinese. But China was politically unstable, with civil war between nationalist and communist forces making life dangerous for foreigners. In 1930, the family returned to Germany, settling in Weil im Schönbuch, a small town in southwestern Germany. Back in Germany, Elizabeth Hartman resumed her aviation activities. She joined a local gliding club and began teaching young people to fly gliders. Gliding was popular in Germany during the 1930s. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from having military aircraft, but gliders weren't considered military equipment, so Germans channeled their aviation passion into gliding. Thousands of young Germans learned to fly gliders, developing skills that would later translate to powered aircraft. Eric began gliding at age 14, taught by his mother. He soloed in a glider in 1936, demonstrating natural flying ability and fearlessness. Gliding required different skills than powered flight: reading air currents, finding thermals to gain altitude, judging glide ratios and landing approaches without engine power. Eric excelled at gliding, winning several junior competitions and earning a reputation as a talented young pilot. His mother watched proudly as her son developed the same passion for flight that had driven her own life. But Germany was changing dramatically. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had taken power in 1933, transforming Germany from a democratic republic to a totalitarian dictatorship. Hitler repudiated the Treaty of Versailles and began secretly rebuilding Germany's military, including the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Young Germans were encouraged to learn flying through organizations like the Hitler Youth, which operated gliding programs designed to identify and train future military pilots. Eric joined the Hitler Youth Gliding Program, not because of political ideology, but because it offered advanced flight training. Like most teenagers, Eric wasn't particularly political. He wanted to fly, and the Hitler Youth provided aircraft and instruction. He progressed quickly through the program, transitioning from basic gliders to more advanced sailplanes, developing skills in aerobatics, navigation, and precision flying. By age 18, Eric had logged hundreds of glider flights and was one of Germany's most accomplished young glider pilots. In October 1940, at age 18, Eric enlisted in the Luftwaffe. Germany was at war. Poland had been conquered, France had fallen, and the Battle of Britain was raging. The Luftwaffe needed pilots desperately, and Eric's extensive gliding experience made him an ideal candidate for fighter pilot training. He entered the Luftwaffe's pilot training program, beginning the transformation from glider pilot to combat fighter pilot. Luftwaffe pilot training was excellent, among the best in the world. Students learned aircraft systems, navigation, aerobatics, gunnery, formation flying, and combat tactics. The training was demanding and dangerous. Accidents were common, and weak students were eliminated. But Eric excelled. His gliding background had given him exceptional feel for aircraft, understanding of aerodynamics, and ability to judge distances and speeds instinctively. He progressed quickly through training, demonstrating natural talent for combat flying. But Eric's personality nearly ended his career before it began. He was irreverent, undisciplined, and often clashed with instructors who demanded strict military discipline. He wore his uniform sloppily, challenged authority, and demonstrated what instructors considered dangerous overconfidence. His flight skills were exceptional, but his attitude was problematic. Several times he nearly washed out of training due to disciplinary issues. Only his obvious flying talent saved him. In October 1942, Eric completed pilot training and was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 52, JG-52, a fighter wing operating on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces. JG-52 was one of the Luftwaffe's most successful fighter wings, with numerous aces and a culture of aggressive, effective combat flying. Eric was 20 years old, freshly trained, and about to enter the most intense aerial combat of World War II.
The Eastern Front was dramatically different from aerial combat over Western Europe. Soviet and German forces fought along a front stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea, thousands of miles of intense combat. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered but had better trained pilots and, in 1942, generally superior aircraft. Soviet pilots were brave but often poorly trained, flying outdated aircraft in mass formations that made them vulnerable to skilled German pilots. Eric's first combat missions were terrifying. He flew Messerschmitt B-109 fighters, escorting German bombers and engaging Soviet fighters. His first missions resulted in no victories. He was too cautious, too overwhelmed by the chaos of aerial combat. He returned from missions having fired his guns but hit nothing. His squadron mates began to question whether the young pilot had the aggression necessary for combat. But Eric was learning. He flew with experienced pilots, observing their tactics, asking questions, and gradually understanding aerial combat. His breakthrough came when he was assigned to fly as wingman to Major Walter Krupinski, one of JG-52's top aces. Krupinski taught Eric the fundamental rule of fighter combat: see, decide, attack, break away. Success came from situational awareness, seeing the enemy first, choosing the right moment to attack, executing decisively, and disengaging before becoming vulnerable. On November 5, 1942, Eric scored his first kill, a Soviet IL-2 Strumovik ground attack aircraft. It wasn't a spectacular victory, but it was crucial psychologically. Eric had proven he could kill in combat. Over the following months, his kill total grew steadily. He shot down Soviet fighters and bombers, developing his personal combat style, waiting for perfect opportunities, attacking decisively, and conserving ammunition through precise shooting. Eric's tactics were based on patience and precision rather than reckless aggression. He avoided unnecessary combat, refusing to engage unless he had clear advantage. He studied enemy aircraft, learning their capabilities and weaknesses. Soviet pilots often flew in rigid formations that limited their ability to maneuver. Eric exploited this, attacking from unexpected angles, shooting accurately, and disengaging before Soviet wingmen could respond. By mid-1943, Eric had become one of JG-52's rising aces. He shot down multiple Soviet aircraft daily during intense periods of combat. His blonde hair earned him the nickname Booby, babyface among German pilots, and the Blonde Knight in propaganda. But Soviet pilots called him something else, the Chorny Chort, the Black Devil, referring to the black tulip painted on his aircraft's nose. Soviet commanders put a bounty on Hartman, supposedly 10,000 rubles for anyone who shot him down. But Eric's success came with costs. He was shot down 16 times during the war, not usually by enemy pilots, but by ground fire, mechanical failures, or being hit by debris from aircraft he had just destroyed. Each time he survived, either crash landing behind German lines or several times behind Soviet lines from which he escaped back to German territory. These experiences were terrifying. Eric spent days evading Soviet forces, hiding in forests, stealing food, and walking dozens of miles back to German positions. One particularly harrowing experience occurred in July 1943. Eric shot down a Soviet aircraft but was hit by return fire. His engine failed and he crash-landed behind Soviet lines. He was immediately captured by Soviet soldiers and loaded into a truck with other prisoners being transported to a POW camp. During the transport, the truck was attacked by German aircraft. In the confusion, Eric escaped into nearby fields, hid for 2 days, and eventually reached German lines. He was flying combat missions again within a week. Eric's kill count climbed relentlessly. By the end of 1943, he had over 150 confirmed victories. By mid-1944, he exceeded 200. By early 1945, he passed 300. He was shooting down Soviet aircraft at a rate that seemed impossible, sometimes multiple victories per mission, sometimes multiple missions per day. His tactics were so effective that he rarely suffered damage, while Soviet pilots seemed helpless against his attacks. But Eric's success created tension with Luftwaffe leadership. High-scoring aces were valuable propaganda, but were also expected to follow orders and maintain military discipline. Eric frequently ignored orders, refused missions he considered suicidal, and openly criticized German tactical decisions. He was grounded several times for insubordination. Commanders threatened court-martial, but Eric's kill count made him too valuable to punish seriously. He was shooting down more Soviet aircraft than entire squadrons combined. Eric's aircraft was distinctive, a Messerschmitt B-109 with a black tulip painted on the nose and a blonde heart on the fuselage, representing his fiancée Ursula or Ush Poch, whom he married in 1944. The black tulip became famous. Soviet pilots learned to recognize it and often refused to engage when they saw it. Some Soviet units reportedly had standing orders to avoid combat with the black tulip aircraft because the losses were too high. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces were advancing into Germany itself. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, aircraft, and pilots, but Eric continued flying, shooting down Soviet aircraft even as German defeat became inevitable. He understood the war was lost but felt loyalty to his squadron mates and refused to abandon them. On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, Eric Hartman had 352 confirmed victories, more than any fighter pilot in history, by a margin of nearly 100 kills.
Eric made a crucial decision as the war ended. Western Allied forces were approaching from the west, while Soviet forces approached from the east. German soldiers who surrendered to Americans or British were generally treated reasonably as POWs. Those who surrendered to Soviets often faced brutal treatment or death. Eric and his squadron flew west, surrendering to American forces, hoping for fair treatment. But the Americans, following agreements made at Yalta, turned German POWs captured in their sector over to Soviet authorities. Eric and his squadron mates were handed to the Soviets in May 1945. It was the beginning of a nightmare. The Soviets considered Eric a war criminal. He had killed hundreds of Soviet pilots. They sentenced him to 25 years hard labor in Soviet prison camps. Eric spent 10 years in Soviet captivity, from 1945 to 1955. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners worked in mines, forests, and construction sites, fed minimal rations, housed in freezing barracks, and subjected to constant political indoctrination. Many prisoners died from exhaustion, disease, or cold. Eric survived through physical toughness, mental resilience, and refusal to cooperate with Soviet attempts to use him for propaganda. The Soviets repeatedly tried to get Eric to denounce Nazi Germany, confess to war crimes, and cooperate with communist propaganda. They offered him better treatment, early release, even comfortable positions if he would make propaganda statements. Eric refused every offer. He insisted that he had been a soldier following orders, that shooting down military aircraft was not a war crime, and that he would not betray his principles for better treatment. His stubborn resistance earned respect from fellow prisoners, but prolonged his captivity. In October 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated the release of German POWs still held in Soviet camps. Eric was among those released. He returned to West Germany after 10 years in Soviet captivity, physically damaged but mentally unbroken. He was 33 years old, had lost 10 years of his life, and returned to a Germany dramatically different from the one he had left. Eric faced difficult choices about his future. He was famous, the highest-scoring fighter ace in history, but that fame came for fighting for Nazi Germany. Post-war Germany was trying to distance itself from the Nazi past, and military heroes from that era were often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. Eric had no education beyond high school and pilot training. His only skills were flying and combat. In 1956, West Germany began rebuilding its military as part of NATO. The Bundesluftwaffe, Federal German Air Force, was created and experienced pilots were needed. Eric joined the new West German Air Force, commissioned as an officer, but his transition to post-war military service was difficult. Modern air forces emphasized following orders and political reliability. Eric still had the same irreverent, undisciplined personality that had caused problems during World War II. Eric's career in the Bundesluftwaffe was controversial. He clashed with superiors over tactics, equipment, and training methods. He believed that German pilots were being trained on inferior American aircraft, F-84 and F-86 fighters, using tactics that didn't suit German fighting style. He advocated for purchasing better aircraft and training pilots in aggressive tactics similar to what had made German pilots effective in World War II. But Eric's most important post-war contribution came in the 1970s and 1980s. He became an advocate for reconciliation between former enemies. He attended Air Force reunions where former Soviet, American, British, and German pilots met and discussed their wartime experiences. He wrote a memoir, The Blonde Knight of Germany, describing his experiences honestly, acknowledging German military skill but not glorifying Nazi ideology. Eric also testified about Soviet prison camp conditions, providing detailed accounts of how Soviet authorities treated German POWs during and after World War II. He spoke about the difference between serving your country in wartime and supporting political ideologies. He had fought for Germany, not for Nazism, and maintained this distinction was important. Former Soviet pilots who had fought against Eric expressed grudging respect. Several attended reunions where they met Eric, acknowledging his skill while noting the tragedy that such skills had been employed in such a terrible war. These encounters between former enemies, sharing memories and finding common humanity, represented post-war reconciliation at its most personal level. Eric Hartman died on September 20, 1993, at age 71 of natural causes. He was buried in Weil and Schönbuch, Germany, the small German town where he had learned to fly as a child. His funeral was attended by former Luftwaffe pilots, Bundesluftwaffe officers, and several former Allied pilots who had come to respect him. He died having never apologized for his wartime service, but also having never glorified the cause he had fought for. Eric Hartman's legacy is complex and debated. He was unquestionably the most successful fighter pilot in history. 352 confirmed victories, a record that will almost certainly never be broken given modern warfare's nature. His tactics and techniques are still studied in Air Force academies worldwide. His survival through 1,425 combat missions and 16 shootdowns demonstrated exceptional skill and luck. But Eric fought for Nazi Germany, a regime responsible for genocide and aggressive war. Modern historians debate whether his military achievements can be separated from the political context. Some argue that soldiers can be evaluated separately from the regimes they serve, that Eric was a professional pilot doing his duty. Others argue that fighting for Nazi Germany, regardless of personal motivation, makes one complicit in Nazi crimes. Eric himself addressed this question in his later years. He acknowledged that he had fought for Nazi Germany, but insisted that he had been a 20-year-old pilot, not a political leader. He had shot down military aircraft attacking German forces, not civilians. He had followed the rules of warfare, never strafed parachuting pilots or attacked civilian targets. He argued that soldiers shouldn't be held responsible for political decisions made by leaders they didn't choose. The moment that defines Eric Hartman's legacy came in a 1989 interview when he was asked about his 352 victories, whether he felt proud or guilty about killing so many men. Eric was silent for a long time, clearly struggling with the question. Then he gave an answer that captured the moral complexity of his life. He said that every victory represented a Soviet pilot who died. He didn't know their names, didn't know if they had families, didn't know their stories. They were enemies trying to kill him and his comrades, and he killed them first. He felt no guilt about that. In combat, you kill or die, and he had done what was necessary to survive. But he also felt no pride. War wasn't glorious. The 352 pilots he killed were men like him, serving their country, and their deaths were tragedies, even if militarily necessary. That was Eric Hartman, the deadliest fighter pilot in history, a man who killed 352 enemy pilots and survived 10 years in Soviet prison camps. A legend who refused to glorify war, even while being celebrated for his martial achievements. His story reminds us that military skill and moral clarity are not the same thing, and that even the most successful warriors can be tragic figures when their skills are employed in terrible causes.